She came back to Pine Hollow Crossing with $43, a duffel bag, and a reputation that arrived 3 days before she did. The land her grandmother left her hadn't produced a real crop in 11 years. The well had gone dry before Clara Wren turned 20. And Grayson Cole, the man who farmed every acre surrounding hers, had already told 3 separate people at the feed store that the Wickham Ridge property was dead ground walking. Clara heard that phrase the morning she pulled into the county. She didn't argue with it. She just parked her truck, walked to the edge of her grandmother's back pasture, and stood there looking at 72 acres of cracked earth and brown grass until the sun went down. Then she went inside and started making a list. If you've stayed this far, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The drive into Pine Hollow Crossing took Clara Wren past 3 things she had been deliberately not thinking about for 6 months. The water tower with the peeling county seal, the grain elevator where her grandfather used to have his accounts, and the long flat stretch of Route 9 that ran adjacent to the Wickham Ridge property line before curving south toward town. She watched the fence posts go by. Weathered cedar, some leaning, one completely collapsed into the ditch, and she told herself the tightness in her chest was just fatigue from the drive. 8 hours from Columbus. She'd stopped once for gas and once because the truck made a sound she didn't recognize, which turned out to be a loose heat shield and not the transmission failure she'd spent 40 miles dreading. The truck was a 2004 Silverado that had been her grandmother's. Nora Wren had left it parked in the barn when she moved into the assisted living facility in Claremont 2 years ago, and it had sat there accumulating mouse droppings and a film of barn dust until Clara drove out last month to retrieve it. The alternator was new. Everything else was original. The heater fan worked on 2 of its 4 settings. The passenger window had to be coaxed shut with a specific sequence of pushing and lifting that Clara had figured out somewhere around Zanesville. She had driven this truck 8 hours because she no longer owned a car. That was one of the facts about her current situation that she was still in the process of absorbing. The other facts were as follows. She was 31 years old. She had spent 4 years as a junior marketing analyst at a mid-sized firm in Columbus that had lost its largest client in February and responded by eliminating 11 positions in March, hers among them. She had a lease on an apartment that ran through August, and a landlord who had already, with some degree of gentleness that she appreciated and resented in equal measure, suggested they discuss her options. She had $1,100 in checking, $400 in savings, and a credit card balance that she was managing, but only barely. She had a degree from Ohio State in agricultural communications, which she had spent the last 7 years apologetically explaining to people who expected something more obviously useful. And she had inherited, upon her grandmother Nora's entry into memory care 14 months ago, the sole legal title to Wickham Ridge Farm, 72 acres of struggling land in Harlan County, Ohio, which she had not set foot on in 4 years and which had not been actively farmed in over a decade. The inheritance had felt, at the time, like a theoretical weight, a responsibility parked at a comfortable distance. Clara had sent the utility payments from Columbus, kept the insurance current, and called the neighbor boy, Evan Rook, who was 23 now and no longer really a boy, to mow the access road twice a year. She had told herself she'd deal with the farm question eventually. Then eventually arrived, wearing the specific face of a layoff notice and an August lease deadline. And suddenly, the farm was not theoretical at all. She turned off Route 9 onto the gravel access road and felt the truck's suspension absorb the familiar irregularity of it. A dip where the drainage culvert sat slightly too low, a ridge of gravel buildup near the gate that never seemed to flatten no matter how many times someone spread new stone over it. She knew these imperfections the way she knew the feel of her own teeth with her tongue. This place had been her summers from age 7 to age 17. She had hated leaving it and then, gradually, learned to be fine without it, and then stopped thinking about the leaving altogether. She stopped the truck at the gate, got out to unlock it, and stood for a moment with the padlock in her hand. The pasture spread out in front of her in the late afternoon light, brown, patchy. The grass that remained was thin and lay close to the ground like it had given up trying to stand. The soil visible between grass clumps was pale and almost powdery looking at the surface, with a harder gray-brown layer visible where a truck tire had pressed through it near the gate. To the west, the ridge itself, a long gradual rise that gave the property its name, looked the same as she remembered it, sparse, rocky at the crown, dotted with cedar scrub, and the invasive multiflora rose that had been advancing for years. To the east, the old equipment barn sat with its sliding door stuck partially open, the way it had been since the hydraulic track rusted through sometime in the early 2000s. The farmhouse was behind her, set back from the road. She hadn't looked at it yet. She was going to look at it in a moment. She was just standing here for a minute. The air smelled like it always had. Dry soil and cedar and something faintly metallic from the iron content in the ridge rock. She had forgotten that smell existed, and it hit her in a way she wasn't prepared for. Not nostalgia exactly, more like a physical memory, the kind that lives in your lungs rather than your head. She put the padlock in her jacket pocket, drove through, got out and closed the gate behind her, and went to look at the house. Bent. Nora Wren had kept his house in reasonable condition until about 3 years before she left it. After that, the maintenance had slipped in the incremental, barely visible way that happens when someone is managing alone and getting older and has other things pulling at their attention. The porch boards were soft in 2 spots near the steps. One of the storm windows on the east side had cracked and been covered with a piece of plywood that had since warped. The gutters on the north side had pulled loose from the fascia and hung at an angle. Inside, everything was clean but worn. The kitchen linoleum bubbled near the sink. The bathroom faucet dripped with the specific persistence of something that had been dripping for years. And the ceiling in the back bedroom showed a stain from a roof leak that had been repaired but not repainted. Clara walked through each room with her phone camera rolling, narrating quietly to herself. Window condition, floor condition, evidence of moisture. She was not doing this for any particular audience. She just found that she absorbed information better when she talked through it. It was a habit from college that had survived into her professional life and now, apparently, into whatever this was. She stopped in the kitchen and opened her notebook. It was a standard composition notebook, black and white cover, the kind that cost $1.20 at a drugstore. She had bought a stack of them the week before. She dated the top of the first page, wrote Wickham Ridge Farm, initial assessment, and began writing down what she'd observed. She wrote for 45 minutes. Then she heated a can of soup on the stove, ate it standing at the kitchen counter, and went to bed. She did not sleep well. The house made sounds she had forgotten, the particular creak of the second step on the staircase, the way the north wind found a gap around the bedroom window and produced a faint whistling that wasn't quite musical. She lay in her grandmother's bed with the ceiling above her and thought about the sequence of decisions that had brought her here and whether they constituted a plan or just a series of retreats from things that had stopped working. She did not come to a conclusion about that. Eventually, she slept. The next morning, she drove into town for supplies and encountered the full weight of Pine Hollow Crossing's opinion of her situation before she'd even found a parking spot. The feed store was called Decker's, and it had been called Decker's since before Clara was born. The current owner was Ray Decker Jr., who had inherited it from Ray Decker Sr. and had continued the family tradition of knowing everyone's business and sharing it freely. Clara walked in at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning and found 3 men she recognized from childhood standing near the back counter with coffee cups. Ray Jr. himself, a cattle farmer named Buford Shea, who had to be close to 70 now, and Grayson Cole. Grayson Cole was 54 years old, built like a man who had spent those years working rather than watching, with a gray beard kept short and a tendency to occupy space in a room in a way that made other people arrange themselves slightly around him. He farmed the 600 acres adjacent to the Wickham Ridge property on the north and east sides. He had been farming them for 25 years, and he was good at it, and he knew he was good at it, and this knowledge had calcified over time into something that looked a lot like certainty about everything. He saw Clara before she saw him, and by the time she processed who he was and arranged her face into something neutral, he had already finished whatever he'd been saying to the others and redirected his attention to her with the specific expression of a man who is about to be helpful in a way that is not entirely helpful. "Clara Wren," he said, "I heard you were back." "Morning," she said. She picked up a basket from the stack near the door. "Mr. Cole." "Grayson, we talked enough over the fence line when you were a kid. You don't need to mister me." He watched her start down the first aisle. "How's Nora doing?" "About the same." Clara found the notebook she needed, a waterproof field journal, the kind with the plastic cover, and put it in her basket. "She has good days." "That's something." He paused. You moving out there full time? That's the plan. There was a beat of silence that carried more weight than silence usually did. You know the well's gone, he said. That well your grandfather put in. Went dry, what, 8, 9 years back? I know. Land's been sitting without water that whole time. He wasn't being cruel about it. That was the frustrating thing. He sounded genuinely informational, like a doctor explaining a diagnosis. Soil structures deteriorated. You'd need a new well to do anything with that ground, and the geological survey they did back in, 2012, 13, came back saying there wasn't much down there to find. Your grandmother didn't want to drill based on that, which I understood, throwing good money after bad. I remember the survey, Clara said. Then you remember what it showed. I remember what it showed. He seemed to consider whether to continue. He continued, I'm not saying it to be discouraging. I'm saying it because I've farmed next to that property for 25 years, and I've watched it change, and the change hasn't gone one direction. What I'm saying is, he paused, chose his words. If you're thinking about trying to turn that back into a working farm, you should go in knowing what you're working with. I appreciate that, Claire said, in a tone that communicated that she did and also didn't. She paid for her supplies, loaded them into the truck, and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before she drove anywhere. She wrote in her notebook, Cole thinks it's dead. Survey from approximately 2012 to 13. Well history. Find the original survey. Find Granddad's well records. She started the truck and drove to the county records office. Arthur Wren had kept records the way some men kept faith, with a constancy that was almost devotional, and with a specificity that suggested he believed every detail mattered, and the day might come when someone would need to know it. He had farmed Wickham Ridge from 1961 until his death in 2003, and over those 42 years he had filled 11 ledgers with field notes, well logs, seasonal observations, livestock records, and hand-drawn maps of the property that documented changes in water table, soil behavior, and pasture performance at a level of detail that struck Clara, reading them for the first time in the county archives, as either extraordinary or slightly obsessive. Possibly both. She had known the ledgers existed. She had not known where they were. It turned out they were here, donated to the county historical archives by her grandmother sometime after Arthur's death, because Nora had considered them important but hadn't wanted them sitting in a house that might flood or burn. The county archivist, a quiet woman named Marlene, had found them in about 8 minutes and left Clara alone with them at a reading table. Clara started with the oldest and worked forward. Her grandfather's handwriting was small and precise, each entry dated, each observation numbered. He had a system, a shorthand she decoded gradually as she read. WL for water level, SP for soil penetration, measured with a rod he apparently pushed into the ground at marked intervals. GP for grazing pressure, which animals had been in which section of the pasture and for how long. He had been tracking his sheep. He had always kept sheep. She remembered that dimly, the smell of the barn, the sound of them in the early morning. She spent 4 hours at the archives. When she left, she had photographed every page of 3 of the 11 ledgers and filled 6 pages of her own notebook with notes. The most important thing she had found was in the 7th ledger, dated 1987, a detailed hand-drawn map of the Wickham Ridge Western pasture, marked with a grid of soil sample locations, and in the lower left quadrant near the ridge base, a notation in her grandfather's careful hand, consistent moisture retention. Sheep return here without being driven. Investigate further for subsurface water potential. Below that notation, a month later. No action taken this season. Next year. She could find no record of next year. She had been back at the farm for 3 days when Evan Rook showed up at 8 in the morning with a chainsaw, a pair of leather gloves, and no particular explanation for his presence. He was tall, taller than she remembered, which felt strange since she'd seen him 2 years ago at Nora's farewell gathering, with the kind of lean that comes from working rather than training. He had a quiet way of occupying space that was entirely different from Grayson Cole's. Where Cole took up room assertively, Evan seemed to take up exactly the amount of space he needed and no more. "Evan," Clara said. "Morning." He set the chainsaw down on the porch. "Heard you were back. Figured I'd come to see what needed doing. You have your own place to look after." "I do." He looked out at the east pasture. But Mrs. Wren was always good to my family, and… He stopped, reconsidered. I just came to help if you want it. You don't have to want it. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup and held it out. I made too much. You want some? He took the cup. They stood on the porch and looked at the pasture in the morning light, and she told him what she was thinking about doing. He listened the way good listeners do, without the restless signaling of a person waiting for their turn to talk. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The sheep idea, he said finally. The sheep idea. Those are going to be hard to find, ones that cost what you can spend. I know. And people are going to say, I know what people are going to say, Clara said. I've been thinking about it for 3 days, and I know every version of what people are going to say, including the version Grayson Cole is specifically going to say. Evan nodded slowly. I was going to say people are going to say you don't know enough about sheep. She hadn't been expecting that particular framing. That's also true, she said. I know a little, he said. My aunt raised Katahdins for 8 years. I helped her some. Not an expert, but… He shrugged. More than nothing. Clara looked at him. He was studying the tree line at the north edge of the pasture with the focused attention of someone who was actually looking at something rather than just looking away from the conversation. More than nothing helps, she said. She found the sheep through a combination of 3 county auction listings, an agricultural classified in a paper 2 counties over, and a conversation with a livestock dealer named Pritchard, who operated out of a barn in the next county and whose primary business seemed to be animals that hadn't worked out somewhere else. The sheep were a mixed lot, mostly Suffolk crosses, a few Katahdins, some unclear on the subject of their own breeding. Underweight, several with minor hoof problems that were treatable but had been left untreated long enough to become more significant than they needed to be. One with a healed ear injury that had left her slightly deaf on the left side, which Clara found herself unreasonably attached to from the first time she saw her. Pritchard walked her through the lot with the attitude of a man who had given up selling things on their merits and moved into a more honest relationship with reality. These aren't show animals, he said. I can see that. Some of them are genuinely fine sheep that just went somewhere bad. Some of them are… He gestured at a particular ewe that was regarding Clara with an expression of deep personal suspicion. Animals with a history. I'll take 94, Clara said. Pritchard looked at her. You've got pasture for that? I've got 72 acres. How's the grass? Thin, she said honestly, but I'm not expecting them to thrive immediately. I'm expecting them to work. He looked at her for another moment. What kind of work? The kind sheep do when you put them somewhere and watch what they do. He didn't fully understand that, she could tell, but he didn't push it. He named his price. She countered. They settled. She wrote him a check that represented most of what she had left in checking and some of what she had in savings, and she loaded 94 sheep into a borrowed trailer over the course of an afternoon that was significantly more complicated than she had anticipated. Evan had come to help. He was good with the animals, patient, unhurried, able to read their movement in a way that suggested actual experience, rather than just confidence. By the time they had the last sheep loaded and the trailer gate latched, it was almost dark, and Clara's arms were shaking slightly from the sustained physical effort. 94, Evan said, looking at the trailer. 94, she confirmed. Grayson Cole is going to… Yeah, I know. He's going to say, walking bones, Clara said. I know. He already started before I even bought them. Someone at Decker's told him I was asking around about sheep, and he came over to the fence line 2 days ago to discuss the decision with me. What did you say? I said I appreciated his input. Evan's mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile. And then I got back in my truck. What? The first 2 weeks were harder than she had prepared for. She had been thinking about what the sheep might do to the land, and she had not thought enough about what 94 sheep required from a human being on a day-to-day basis. The animals that had hoof problems needed to be caught, treated, and rechecked. The one she'd privately named Hattie, the partially deaf ewe, developed a respiratory issue in the first week that required 3 trips to the agricultural vet in Claremont. 2 of the Suffolk crosses were dominant in a way that caused problems with the rest of the flock's grazing distribution until she figured out how to work around their behavior. One sheep escaped through a gap in the east fence line and was found by Evan 2 fields over, apparently content in someone else's clover. She recorded everything. Every morning she walked the pasture before anything else, before coffee, before anything, with her notebook and her phone. She noted which sections of the pasture had been grazed overnight, which the flock seemed to avoid, where they gathered when they weren't moving. She photographed the ground condition in marked locations, comparing image to image over days and then weeks to track what was changing. She pushed her grandfather's soil rod, found in the barn, steel rod with depth markings, the kind of instrument that was completely low-tech and completely effective, into the ground at the same grid points Arthur had used and logged the resistance readings. The western section of the pasture was different from the rest. She noticed it in the first week, and by the third week she was certain of it. The sheep went there. Not always, not exclusively, but with a consistency that resisted coincidence. They grazed other sections, moved around the property, used the entire pasture in the way animals do. But late afternoon, as the heat shifted, a significant portion of the flock drifted west. They grazed differently there, more deliberately, more settled. They lay down in that section at evening. The ground there, when she pushed the soil rod, showed less surface resistance than the rest of the pasture, not dramatically, but measurably. She photographed the patterns. She mapped them. She wrote down every variable she could think of that might explain them. Then she went back to her grandfather's ledger photographs and found the map with the notation about the western pasture. Consistent moisture retention. Sheep return here without being driven. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, looking at the photograph of her grandfather's handwriting, and then looking at her own notebook, and then back. This was not proof of anything. She understood that. Animals behave for 100 reasons. Soil conditions have 50 explanations, and pattern recognition is notoriously vulnerable to the desire to find a pattern. She had a background in agricultural communications, not hydrology. She was not a scientist, but she was also not wrong about what she was seeing. She was watching it every day. And her grandfather had watched the same thing in the same place 40 years ago and written it down. She found the number for the county extension office and called them about getting a current soil moisture analysis done. She also, separately, started asking around about drilling rates. Grayson Cole came over the fence line on a Wednesday in the middle of the 4th week. Clara was in the west pasture with Evan, marking stake positions for a moisture monitoring grid, when she heard the four-wheeler and looked up to see Cole parking it at the fence and climbing through between the wires with the easy familiarity of a man who had been doing that for decades. He looked at the stakes. He looked at the flock, which had drifted west ahead of him the way they usually did in the afternoon. He looked at Evan without hostility but without warmth. Then he looked at Clara. "People are saying you're thinking about drilling," he said. "People are saying a lot of things," Clara said. "Are they wrong about this one?" She looked at him steadily. "I'm doing moisture analysis, soil work. I'm trying to understand the property. The survey in 2012 said there was nothing down there worth finding. I've read the survey." "Then you know what you're looking at." "I know what the survey said." Cole's jaw shifted slightly. The specific micro-expression of a man who is not used to having his logic interrupted at that step. "A survey's a survey," he said. You can't just decide there's water because you want there to be water." "I'm not deciding there's water," Clara said, with a patience that was costing her something. "I'm deciding to find out what's there. Those are different things." "And the sheep?" He looked at the flock. Several of them had settled in the western corner, lying in the grass with the afternoon contentment of animals that had decided a spot was good and saw no reason to leave it. "You're spending money you don't have on animals nobody else wanted to tell you where to drill." Something hot moved through Clara's chest and she pushed it back down. "Nobody else wanted them," she said, "because nobody else was watching what they were doing." Cole looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression that wasn't quite contempt, something more complicated. The look of a man who has been certain about something for a long time and has just heard the first sentence that might require him to reconsider the certainty. He didn't pursue it. "The soil work's your money to spend," he said. "Just don't drill without real data. A dry hole out here costs more than you've got." He walked back to the fence line, ducked through, and drove back toward his property. Evan watched the four-wheeler disappear. "He's not wrong about the cost," he said. "No," Clara agreed. "He's not wrong about that." She looked at the sheep in the western corner. Hattie was among them, lying slightly apart from the others with her good ear turned toward something Clara couldn't hear. "But He's wrong about the rest of it, she said. She picked up her marking stake and went back to work. Basan. The soil analysis came back 6 weeks after she'd submitted the samples. She picked up the report from the extension office, sat in the parking lot, and read it twice. The western section showed measurably higher subsoil moisture than the rest of the property. Not dramatically higher, not the kind of reading that would make a hydrologist sit up and start calling colleagues, but measurably, consistently higher across multiple sample points, in a pattern that aligned almost exactly with the locations her grandfather had marked and the locations where the sheep congregated. She called the extension office agronomist, a woman named Sandra Torres, who had the brisk efficiency of someone who handles 20 counties and doesn't have time to be cagey about her opinions. "What am I looking at?" Clara asked. "Elevated moisture retention in the subsoil in that western quadrant. Could be several things. Composition difference, different clay content. Could be fracture patterns in the underlying bedrock channeling water from the ridge. Could be an old drainage pattern that's retained some subsurface flow. Could it indicate water at depth?" A pause. "It could indicate the conditions that sometimes accompany water at depth. It's not evidence of water at depth. Those are different things." "I know," Clara said, "but it's not evidence against it either." Another pause, this one with a different quality. "No," Torres said slowly, "it's not evidence against it." Clara drove home. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her grandfather's ledger photographs again and looked at the map. Then she opened her own notebook to the section where she had been tracking the flock's movement patterns, and she spread out the printout of the soil analysis, and she laid the 3 pieces of information next to each other. The pattern was the same in all 3, separated by 40 years, arrived at by different methods, confirming the same thing. She turned to a new page in her notebook and wrote, "Next step, find a driller." Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see the western pasture in the last light. The sheep settled there for the evening, the ridge above them dark against the sky. She looked at it for a long time before she closed the notebook and started thinking about dinner. Finding a driller willing to work Wickham Ridge turned out to be its own particular education. The first man she called was a driller named Hoskins, who operated out of the next county over. He had a decent reputation, a 20-year track record in Harlan County groundwater work, and a truck that Clara could hear idling in the background when he answered his phone. He listened to her describe the property, the soil analysis results, her grandfather's mapping, the sheep behavior patterns. He was quiet on his end for long enough that she thought the call had dropped. "You said the 2012 survey came back dry," he said finally. "It came back showing insufficient evidence of water at economic depth. That's not the same as dry." That's a distinction a lot of people make right before they spend money on a hole that doesn't produce. "I understand that." "Who did the survey?" She told him. He made a sound that was not quite a word. "What?" she said. "Nothing, just that outfit. They ran a lot of surveys in this county around that time. Fast work, not always thorough." He paused. "I'm not saying your land has water. I'm saying that particular survey isn't the definitive word I'd stake money on." That was more than she had expected from a cold call. She pushed forward. "Would you come out and look?" "I can come out and look. Looking doesn't cost anything. Drilling does." "I know what drilling costs." "Do you?" Not unkind, just direct. She told him her number. He was quiet again. "That's tight," he said. "I know. If we hit nothing at that budget, then I've spent money I don't have on a dry hole," she said. "I understand the math. I'm asking if you'll come look at the site." He came out the following Thursday. He was a compact, weathered man in his 60s who walked the western pasture slowly, stopping often, crouching down to press his fingers into the soil at various points. He didn't say much. The sheep watched him with the collective alertness of animals that weren't sure whether he was a threat or just a new and uninteresting feature of their environment. He had brought a device Clara didn't recognize, a handheld unit with a small screen, and he moved it across the surface in slow passes, watching the readings without explaining what he was watching for. Clara walked with him and kept quiet. She had learned in the last several weeks that her instinct to fill silence with explanation was not always useful, and that some people thought better without it. After an hour and a half, Hoskins stopped at the corner of the western pasture, the exact corner where the sheep consistently gathered, where the soil analysis had shown the strongest moisture readings, where her grandfather's map showed the notation about subsurface water potential. He stood there looking at the ridge above, then at the ground, then at his device. "Your grandfather mapped this property," he said. "Yes." "And he marked this location specifically?" 40 years ago. More. Hoskins looked at the ridge. "There's a fracture line in that ridge rock. I can see it from here if you know what you're looking at. Runs roughly northeast to southwest. A fracture like that can channel water downslope and hold it in the lower substrata." He looked at his device again. "There's something down there. I'm not going to tell you it's enough water to run a farm on, because I don't know that yet. But there's something." Clara felt something move through her that she didn't let show on her face. "How deep?" she said. "Hard to say without drilling. Could be 60 feet, could be 100. If the fracture is what I think it is, you might hit pressurized flow. That's the good scenario." He looked at her. "The bad scenario is you get moisture, but no volume. Enough to show on a log, not enough to use." "What would you do?" Claire said. "If it were your land?" He looked at the ground for a long moment. "I'd drill it," he said. "But I've been doing this 30 years and I'm standing on your property right now. That's worth something." She asked him his rate. They talked numbers. She would have to move money she hadn't planned to move, delay 2 repairs to the equipment barn she'd been pricing, and eat through the last of her savings buffer. She wrote down the figure and looked at it. "I need a week," she said. "Take 2, Hoskins said. "I'm booked through the end of the month anyway." She didn't tell anyone she had called a driller. She had reasons for this that she didn't fully examine, partly pragmatic, because she didn't want Grayson Cole having more to say about it before she'd made her own decision, and partly something more personal, the particular privacy of a gamble you haven't committed to yet. When you tell people, it becomes real in a different way. It becomes a thing that can fail publicly. But Evan knew. He noticed things the way careful people do. Not by prying, but by paying attention to the details others walked past. He noticed the way she moved through the western pasture with a more focused attention, the way she reviewed her notebook in the evenings with the systematic quality of someone building a case rather than recording observations. He noticed when Hoskins' truck was parked at the gate for an afternoon and didn't ask about it that day, but brought it up 3 days later with the timing of someone who had decided to wait until she was ready. They were replacing a section of fence on the north boundary. Physical work, the kind that fills your hands and leaves your mind available for conversation. Claire was running the wire and Evan was setting the post anchor when he said, without looking up from what he was doing, "Hoskins came out." "He did," Claire said. "And?" "And he thinks there might be something." Evan straightened up and looked at her across the fence line. "How much does something cost to find out about?" She told him. He went back to working the post anchor. She could see him thinking, not the dramatized thinking of someone performing consideration, just the quiet, actual version of a person running numbers and not being sure of the math. "I can cover part of it," he said. "No. Clara, it's my farm and my gamble. You're not covering part of it." "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering—" He stopped. "Look, if that well comes in, this farm starts being worth something again. And I've put 2 years of weekends into this place already. I've got skin in it, whether you want me to or not." She pulled the wire taut and didn't answer for a moment. The problem with the argument was that it wasn't wrong, exactly. He had put time in. He had shown up without being asked and stayed without being asked to stay. That was a kind of investment, regardless of what either of them called it. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's the same as no." "It's the same as I'll think about it." He let it go. They finished the fence section in the late afternoon and stood back to look at it. Not perfect. Clara could already see one post that was going to need resetting in a few months, but solid enough for now, which was mostly what you could ask. The well decision got made in the kitchen on a Thursday night when Clara spread out all her numbers on the table. Actual paper, pen and ink accounting, rather than a spreadsheet, because she thought better when she could see the numbers in her own handwriting. She had the farm's income side, which was currently almost nothing. Some wool from the flock's first shearing that Evan had helped her process, and that she had sold to a small regional buyer for less than she'd hoped. She had the expense side, which was the entire rest of the paper. She had a remaining cash position, which fit on one line without needing much space. She looked at it for a long time. Without water, the land could support the sheep at reduced capacity, but couldn't expand. Without expansion, the wool revenue would never pay the property taxes plus the equipment costs plus the ongoing flock management. Without those covered, she was running a time-limited experiment that ended when the money ran out, which she could see clearly from the numbers on the table would be approximately 8 to 10 months from now. With water, real water, a working well, the calculation changed in almost every direction at once. Irrigated pasture, expanded flock, the possibility of vegetable production on the eastern acres that had better soil structure, the farm becoming a functioning unit rather than a holding action. The risk was the hole. The dry hole that cost the money she couldn't lose. She sat there until midnight. Then she called Hoskins' number and left a voicemail saying she wanted to schedule the work. She closed her notebook and went to bed. She slept badly, but for a different reason than usual. Not anxiety exactly, more the particular restlessness of someone who has made a decision and is now waiting for the consequences to arrive. 2 weeks after she scheduled the drilling, Grayson Cole found out. She was not sure how. The county was the county. Information moved the way water does, finding channels and gaps and unexpected routes. Someone at the hardware store probably, or someone who had seen Hoskins' truck. It didn't matter. What mattered was that on a Monday morning, Cole appeared at her gate in his truck rather than his four-wheeler, which indicated he had decided this was a driving-over conversation rather than a fence-line conversation, and that the distinction was significant. She came out to meet him before he got to the house. "I heard you called Hoskins," he said. "Word travels," she said. "Clara." He stopped. Took his hat off, which was not something she had seen him do before. He was holding it in both hands, not quite wringing it, but close. "That well survey from 2012. I was there when they ran it. I watched part of it. Those men knew what they were doing." Hoskins didn't seem so sure about that survey. "Hoskins?" Cole stopped again. "Hoskins is a good driller. He's not a hydrologist. There's a difference." "I know the difference." "Then you know that what you're doing is betting on your grandfather's sheep notes and a handful of soil samples from an outfit that covers 200 square miles of this county and charges $200 a sample." His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not anger, something with more weight than that. "If you drill a dry hole at the price Hoskins charges, that's not a setback. That's the end. You understand what I'm telling you?" Clara looked at him. "I understand what you're telling me." "Do you actually?" "Grayson." She kept her voice level. "I hear you. I've done the numbers. I know what a dry hole means. I've looked at everything I have access to. My grandfather's records, the soil data, the fracture pattern in the ridge that Hoskins identified, and I've decided the evidence points somewhere. Maybe I'm wrong. I might be wrong. But I've been watching that western pasture for 2 months, and my grandfather watched it for 40 years before me, and neither of us saw nothing there. We saw something." He looked at her with the expression she was starting to recognize. That complicated look, the one that wasn't contempt, that she couldn't fully read. "The sheep," he said flatly. "The sheep. You're telling me you're spending your last real money because sheep keep walking to a corner of your pasture. I'm telling you, the sheep are part of a pattern that includes soil data, a driller's visual assessment of fracture geology, and 40 years of documented observation by a man who farmed this land successfully for 4 decades. The sheep are not the only data point. They're one of several that all point the same direction." Cole put his hat back on. He looked toward the western pasture, where the flock was visible in the middle distance, scattered across the grass in the loose, wandering way of animals with no particular urgency. Some of them were working their way west already, though it wasn't afternoon yet. "Walking bones?" he said. But there was less certainty in it this time. It sounded more like a habit than a conviction. "They're not walking bones," Claire said. "They were underfed and undertreated and sold by people who didn't want to deal with them. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to do. They're doing it better than I expected." Cole got back in his truck without answering. Clara stood in the drive and watched him go, and then turned back toward the house with the feeling of someone who has held a position under fire and isn't sure whether that's a victory or just a temporary pause in the argument. Hoskins came on a Wednesday at the end of the following week, with a second truck behind him carrying equipment Clara couldn't name. He had brought a younger man, heavy-set and efficient, who handled the equipment with the practiced ease of someone who had done this particular work 1,000 times and was comfortable with the repetition. They set up in the western corner of the pasture with a precision that suggested Hoskins had been thinking about the exact location since his initial visit. The flock did not appreciate the equipment. Evan spent most of the first morning moving sheep away from the drill site and toward the eastern pasture, which they accepted with the resentful compliance of animals that understood they were being redirected but registered their objection through sustained bleating. Hattie alone approached the equipment with direct curiosity, getting within 10 feet of the drill unit before Evan redirected her with a patience Clara found remarkable. "She's going to give me gray hair," he said. "She already has," Clara said. Hoskins walked her through the process before they started, not because she'd asked, but apparently because he was a man who felt better when the person paying understood what they were paying for. The drill would go down in stages. They would pull samples at regular intervals. If the fracture zone was where he believed it was, they should encounter it somewhere between 60 and 90 feet. The pressurized zone, if it existed, would be below that. "If we get to 120 and we haven't hit anything meaningful," he said, "we're going to have a conversation." "I understand," Clara said. "You doing okay?" he asked. Not medically. He said it the way experienced people say it to people who are about to spend their last money on a gamble. "Ask me tomorrow," Clara said. He actually smiled at that. Small, brief, genuine. "Fair enough," he said, and went to start the drill. The first day produced soil samples and rising anxiety and nothing else. Hoskins showed her the samples at intervals, the composition changing as they went deeper, the color shifting from the pale surface material through darker clay layers into something grayer and more dense. He explained what each change meant with the specificity of a man who found the subject genuinely interesting rather than just professionally relevant. Clara listened to all of it and wrote it down and tried not to calculate how many feet remained before the 120-foot conversation. That evening, Evan stayed for dinner, which had become something that happened a few times a week without either of them formally arranging it. Clara made soup from what was in the refrigerator. Nothing strategic, just what was there. And they ate at the kitchen table with her grandfather's ledger photographs spread to one side and her notebook open to the current week's observations. "What does your gut say?" Evan asked. "I don't trust my gut," Clara said. "My gut got me into a job I hated for 3 years before I got laid off from it." "That's not the same kind of gut. It's the same person." She stirred her soup. "The data says there's something there. The data's not wrong about what it shows. Whether what it shows means water at depth and volume. That's the part where the data runs out and it becomes something else." "Faith," Evan said. "I was going to say a calculated bet," Clara said, "but fine." He looked at the ledger photographs. Arthur Wren's handwriting, the careful grid, the notation about the western pasture. "He was a good farmer," Evan said. "My dad always said so. Said he was the kind of man who watched things and thought about what he was watching, which not everyone does." Clara looked at the photograph of the map. Her grandfather's notation, nearly 40 years old, in handwriting so specific she could recognize it now across 100 pages. "He started to investigate," she said, "and then didn't. Something stopped him." "Money, probably," Evan said. "Or time, or both. That's usually how it goes." She nodded slowly. That was probably right. You see something, you note it, you tell yourself you'll come back to it. Life moves around the intention, and the intention doesn't go anywhere. It just waits. She looked at her own notebook, her observations layered over his, 40 years apart, the same piece of ground, the same indication. It felt like a conversation with someone she hadn't spoken to in a long time. The second drilling day started overcast and stayed that way. The drill went to 60 feet before 9 in the morning. By noon, they were at 70. The samples kept coming. Hoskins studied each one, said little, kept the drill moving. Clara stayed at the site. She had work she needed to do, fence checks, flock management, 3 weeks of equipment barn repairs she kept deferring, but she couldn't make herself leave. She sat on an overturned feed bucket at a distance that was out of the way and watched the drill work and wrote in her notebook and tried to do anything with her attention other than calculate. At 2 in the afternoon, Hoskins stopped the drill. Clara stood up. He was examining a sample. He turned it over in his hand, then looked up the ridge line, then looked at her. "Come here," he said. She walked over. He held out the coarse sample, a cylinder of material extracted from 73 feet below where she was standing. The lower half of it was darker than the upper, visibly more saturated. She could see the moisture in it. Not wet exactly, but dense with it, the way soil gets when it's been in contact with water for a long time. Fracture zone, Hoskins said. Right where I thought it was. He set the sample down. Below this, we should hit the aquifer layer if it's there. Could be another 15-20 feet. He looked at her steadily. Or it could be a seep, a wet layer that looks good on the sample and produces almost nothing when you try to draw from it. We don't know yet. Keep drilling, Claire said. He held her gaze for a moment. We keep drilling, he said, and went back to the equipment. The flock had drifted back toward the western pasture boundary during the afternoon despite Evan's efforts. Hattie was standing at the fence line with her good ear forward, watching the drill site with the focused attention she usually reserved for things she had decided were interesting. Several others had gathered near her in the loose proximity of animals following an animal that seemed to know something. Clara looked at them and looked at the drill and thought about her grandfather standing in the same place 40 years ago, noting the same pattern, writing it down, and then, for whatever reason, not drilling. She had drilled. The core sample was sitting on Hoskins' equipment case, 73 feet of information, dark with moisture at the bottom, where the fracture had held it. That was real. That was not a pattern she had imagined into existence. At 4:17 in the afternoon, the drill hit pressure. She heard it before Hoskins announced it. A change in the sound of the equipment, a shift in the drill's resistance that was audible even from where she was standing. Hoskins' assistant stepped back from the casing. Hoskins was already adjusting the pressure gauges, watching the readings with the focused attention of a man who had heard that sound before and was now finding out what it meant this time. Hold on, Hoskins said, to no one in particular, or possibly to the equipment itself. Clara stood completely still. For a moment, nothing happened. The drill sound changed again. The assistant checked the casing connection. Hoskins watched the gauges. Then the gauge needle moved. There it is, Hoskins said quietly. There it is. The reading was climbing. Claire could see it from where she stood, could see the needle moving with the specific intention of something that had been held under pressure for a long time and had found an opening. Hoskins was saying numbers out loud, technical readings she didn't fully follow, but she didn't need to follow the vocabulary to read the posture of the man watching the gauges. The way his shoulders changed, the way he exhaled. That's flow, he said. That's real flow. This isn't a seep. He turned and looked at Clara, and his expression was the most honest thing she had seen in months. No performance, no management, just a man who had been uncertain this morning and was now certain of something different. You've got water, he said. Good water, pressurized. I'll need to run the full test to quantify it, but... He shook his head slightly. That's a working well. Clara sat back down on the feed bucket. Not from weakness. Her legs were fine. She just needed to sit down for a moment and let the information arrive properly. She looked at the gauge, still climbing. She looked at the core sample, dark with the moisture that had been pointing at this for 2 months. She looked at the flock along the fence line, Hattie still watching with her good ear forward, as if she had been waiting for the humans to catch up to something she had already known. Evan came from the direction of the equipment barn at a half run, having heard something in the equipment sounds change from 50 yards away. He stopped when he saw her face. She nodded once. He put his hands on top of his head and looked up at the sky and then back at her. Okay, he said. Okay. Yeah, Claire said. She opened her notebook to a new page. She wrote the date, the time, the depth. 78 feet, which was where the pressure had broken through. And Hoskins's preliminary flow assessment. She wrote it down the way her grandfather would have written it, factual, precise, dated. Then she looked at it on the page, and for the first time in a long time, the numbers told a story she wanted to hear. The full flow test took 3 days. Hoskins ran it the way he ran everything, methodically, without hurry, without the kind of optimistic commentary that would have made Clara feel better in the short term and less prepared in the long term. He installed the temporary pump casing, ran the equipment through 2 full cycles, and took readings at 6-hour intervals while Clara tried to do other things on the farm and failed to fully do any of them. She kept finding reasons to walk back to the western pasture. She told herself she was checking on the flock. She was not really checking on the flock. The flock was fine. The flock was better than fine. They had adjusted to the drill equipment with the pragmatic indifference of animals that had decided something was neither food nor threat and therefore not worth their attention. Even Hattie had stopped stationing herself at the fence line and gone back to grazing, her good ear occasionally swiveling toward the pump casing with mild professional interest. On the morning of the third day, Hoskins called her over to the equipment case, where he had his clipboard and his calculations laid out in the specific arrangement of a man about to deliver a verdict. 12 gallons per minute sustained flow, he said, consistent across all 3 testing windows, pressure holding steady at the casing. He looked up from the clipboard. For a single-family agricultural operation your size, you need about 3 to 5 gallons per minute to be considered viable. You've got 12. Clara looked at the number on his clipboard. 12. She had run the math beforehand on what she needed, and she knew what 12 meant. And she stood there looking at it with the specific feeling of someone who has been holding their breath for so long they've forgotten what normal breathing feels like. That's enough, she said. Not a question. That's more than enough, Hoskins said. You'll have to case it properly, run the permanent pump installation, get the water quality test done before you use it for anything. That's standard, takes about a week to get the lab results back, but the volume is there. He paused. Your grandfather's map had this right. He didn't drill it. No. Hoskins considered something. Might have been the 1987 land values, might have been the drilling costs at that time, might have been a dozen things. But he found it. He looked at her. He found it again. She thanked him. She paid him the balance of his invoice from the envelope she had prepared, actual cash because she had drawn it out of the bank rather than writing a check she'd have to watch clear, and she watched his truck and the equipment truck pull out of the access road and turn north on Route 9. Then she stood alone at the well casing in the western pasture and looked at the ridge above her, at the fracture line that Hoskins had pointed out, visible now that she knew where to look. A dark seam in the pale rock face, where the geology had shifted and the water had followed the shift downward for however many thousands of years it took stone to tell that kind of story. She put her hand on top of the well casing. The steel was warm from the afternoon sun. Okay, Granddad, she said quietly, I see it. She didn't say it to anyone in particular, just said it, the way you sometimes do when you finish something a person you loved started and couldn't finish. The news moved through Pine Hollow Crossing the way news always moved, faster than anyone could track, and slower than anyone wanted to admit. By the day after Hoskins pulled out, 3 people had mentioned the well to Clara in passing at the hardware store and the post office. By the end of the week, it was the subject of a conversation at Decker's that Clara heard about secondhand from Ray Jr. himself, who seemed to find the situation entertaining in a way that suggested he had placed some kind of informal bet on the outcome. People are surprised, Ray told her, with the careful understatement of a man who meant something more pointed than what he was saying. People were sure it was dry ground, Clara said. Some people were more sure than others. She bought her supplies and left. She knew what Ray Jr. was gesturing at. The more sure person had not come by the farm since the drilling. She had not expected him to exactly, but she was aware of the absence. The awareness was complicated. She didn't want Grayson Cole's acknowledgement. She hadn't done this to prove something to him, and the well's water didn't become more real because he admitted it was there. But she was human, and she had sat across a fence line from his certainty for months, and there was something in her that registered the silence as its own kind of response. Not satisfying, just there. It was Evan who told her Cole had been asking around. They were running a water line from the new well casing toward the equipment barn, a first, temporary version of what would eventually be a full farm irrigation system, but functional enough to start making a difference in how the land was being managed. It was physical work that required both of them, and they had developed a rhythm over the months that made working together easier than working apart on most things, a fact Clara had stopped examining for implications and simply accepted as useful. Ray Decker told me, Evan said, feeding the line through the conduit they'd laid. Cole came in asking about Hoskins' rates, about what the drilling test had shown. Clara held tension on the line. Why would he ask Hoskins' rates? I don't think he's thinking about drilling, Evan said. I think he was asking because he wanted to know what the numbers were, what your numbers were. He glanced at her. I think he's trying to figure out how wrong he was. Doesn't matter how wrong he was. It does to him. She thought about that while they worked. Cole was not a man who was wrong about land. He had been farming this county for 25 years, and he was good at it, and he knew he was good at it. Being wrong about this particular piece of ground, being wrong in public, in front of people who had watched him declare it dead. That was a different kind of wrong than a bad crop season or a misjudged equipment purchase. That was a structural error, the kind that required you to reconsider the foundation of how you thought you understood things. She wasn't sure she felt sorry for him, but she understood it. The water quality results came back 8 days after the samples were submitted. Clara picked up the report from the extension office and read it in the parking lot the way she'd read the soil analysis months earlier, twice, carefully, looking for anything that would complicate the news. There was nothing to complicate it. The water was clean. Low mineral content, no detectable contaminants, pH within the range suitable for both livestock and irrigation. Sandra Torres at the extension office, when Clara called to ask a follow-up question about irrigation suitability for the eastern pasture, was more forthcoming than she had been on the first call. The brisk efficiency was still there, but something in it had shifted, a slightly different quality of attention. "You've got good water," Torres said. "The mineral profile is actually better than most wells in that county. Whatever's in that fracture system has been filtering for a long time." "What do I do first?" Clara said. "If I want to start building toward actual pasture irrigation, start with your highest value sections. Don't try to water everything at once. You'll spread yourself thin and nothing gets enough. Pick 2 sections where the soil response will be fastest and start there. Let the results tell you what to expand." "The western section first," Clara said. "The soil profile there is already showing the strongest recovery." "Then start there," Torres said, "and call me when you're ready to talk about the eastern acres. There's a soil amendment approach that might work for that section, given what you described in your analysis." Clara wrote everything down. She added Torres's extension number to her contacts. Then she sat for another few minutes in the parking lot, looking at the water quality report, at the numbers that said the ground beneath Wickham Ridge had been holding something clean and pressurized and usable for longer than anyone had known to look. She thought about how close she had come to not drilling, about the night at the kitchen table with the numbers spread out in her own handwriting, the margin between doing it and retreating from it. She thought about the feed bucket she'd sat on while Hoskins watched the pressure gauge climb, about the way her legs had been fine, but she'd needed to sit anyway. Then she put the report in her notebook and drove home. Grayson Cole came on a Saturday morning, not his four-wheeler, not his truck. He walked across the fence line the way farmers sometimes do when they're not making an official visit. Just a man cutting across a property line to talk to a neighbor, the informal version of a formal thing. Clara saw him coming from the kitchen window and went out to meet him on the porch. She had coffee. She didn't offer him any immediately, which was a small, deliberate choice she made and did not entirely analyze. He looked different without the four-wheeler, without the truck. Smaller, maybe. Or just more ordinary. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the western pasture for a moment before he looked at her. "I heard the flow test numbers," he said. "You heard right. 12 gallons per minute." He said it the way people say numbers that have reorganized something for them. Slowly, as if checking that the number still means the same thing it meant when they first heard it. 12, Clara confirmed. He nodded. He was looking at the western pasture again. The flock was out there in the morning light, scattered across the grass, some grazing, some drifting toward the now permanent well casing where the trough was filled for the first time in years. Hattie was at the trough. She was always at the trough when there was something new to investigate. "I told people it was dead ground," Cole said. Not defensively, more like a man reading from a record he had to read accurately. "You did. I told you specifically, a number of times." "You did that too." He was quiet for a moment. The thing she had noticed about Grayson Cole, the complicated expression she'd been reading for months, was there again, and she finally understood it well enough to name it. It was the look of a man who had built his certainty on experience, who had earned that certainty through actual years of actual work, and who was now confronting the possibility that experience can build walls as efficiently as it builds knowledge. He had seen dry land and called it dry because he had seen dry land before, and it had always been dry. He had not looked harder because looking harder had never been required. That was not stupidity. It was a different kind of mistake. "I was wrong," he said. Just that. 3 words, no architecture around them. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she wanted to say. She had thought about this conversation in various hypothetical versions since about 3 weeks after she'd moved back. She had rehearsed the sharpest version, the version that documented exactly how it had felt to stand in a feed store parking lot and hear from Ray Jr. that Cole had told 3 people her land was dead. She had rehearsed a cooler version, precise and fair, that acknowledged his experience while refusing his conclusions. Neither of them arrived. What she said instead was, the land wasn't dead. It was just misread. He looked at her. Something in his face moved. Your grandfather's notes, he said. You had the original marking. I had the original marking, and I had the sheep and the soil data and a driller who knew what a fracture pattern looked like from the surface. She paused. None of those things would have mattered if I hadn't been here long enough to see the pattern. I've been here 25 years, Cole said. Not defensively, almost as if he was saying it to himself. You were farming your land, Clara said. I was trying to read this one. The distinction sat between them. He didn't dispute it. Cole looked out at the flock again. Several of the sheep had gathered near the trough and were doing the sideways press thing that animals do when they all want access to a limited space. Mild, persistent jostling, each animal convinced that the same water from a slightly different angle would be better. He watched them with what looked for a moment like genuine attention. Walking bones, he said. Walking bones, she agreed. I said that to 3 people at Decker's. Ray Jr. told me. Ray Jr. would. Cole exhaled slowly. Those are not bad sheep, are they? They're complicated sheep, Clara said. Some of them are genuinely difficult, but they're not bad. He almost smiled. Not quite. But his face did something in the vicinity of a smile, which was the most unexpected thing Clara had seen in months. I'll say it to whoever you want, he said, about being wrong, if it would help you. She looked at him. The offer was real. She could hear it was real. It was the offer of a man who understood that public errors required public corrections and who was prepared to do that uncomfortable thing. Say it when it comes up naturally, she said. I don't need a tour. He nodded once, seemed relieved, but in a measured way, the way people are relieved when they've done something hard and it cost roughly what they expected rather than more. That eastern section, he said after a pause. The acres past the old equipment trail. What are you thinking for it? The question surprised her. Not the subject, but the manner of it. It was the question one farmer asks another farmer, an equals question. Torres at the extension office has some thoughts about soil amendment, Clara said slowly. I haven't worked it through yet. That ground used to drain east off the ridge before your grandfather put the access trail in, Cole said. Change the flow pattern. If you pulled the trail or regraded it, you might get some of that natural drainage back. Work with the water table instead of against it. Clara looked at him. I didn't know about the drainage change. I watched him do it, Cole said. I was 17 or 18. My father's land was adjacent then. East section used to be part of my family's original parcel before they sold it off. I've been looking at that property line since before you were born. The implication of that was not small. 25 years of adjacent farming and all the institutional knowledge that came with it. The drainage history, the land behavior, the decades of observation that could have been a resource rather than an obstacle. She had assumed his certainty was the whole of what he brought. She had been partially wrong about that. Could you walk me through where the old drainage ran? She said. He looked at her, slightly surprised, she thought, though he kept it contained. I can do that. Not today, when you have time. I'll have time Wednesday. Wednesday, then. He left the way he came, back across the fence line on foot, and Clara watched him go and thought about how long it took sometimes for 2 people to start having the right conversation, how much energy went into the wrong one first. She didn't have a clean feeling about it, not resolved, not finished, just the sense of a channel opening up that had been silted over. She went inside and wrote it down. The week after Cole's visit, 2 things happened that she had not anticipated. The first was a call from a woman named Ruth Halsey, who introduced herself as a county extension agricultural specialist, different from Torres, who handled soil and water specifically. Ruth worked on livestock programs, she explained, and she had heard about the Wickham Ridge flock through Torres and through the county agriculture office's informal network. She had heard about the sheep's behavior during the drilling assessment. She was calling because she was putting together a small county case study project on adaptive livestock behavior and degraded land recovery, and she wanted to know if Clara would be willing to be included. What does included mean? Clara asked. Primarily documentation. Your records, your observation logs, the correlation between flock behavior and the water location. We'd want to do a formal write-up. It would go into the county ag extension archive, might get shared at the state level. A pause. It's not compensation. I want to be clear about that. But it would be an official record of what you found here and how you found it. Clara thought about her grandfather's ledgers, sitting in the county archives in plastic sleeves, the careful notation about the western pasture, the observation he had never followed up on. She thought about what it would mean for those ledgers to be part of the same official record that documented their conclusion 40 years later. Yes, she said, I'll participate. The second thing was less official and more immediately complicated. She was at the equipment barn when a truck she didn't recognize pulled up the access road. A clean truck, not a working farm truck, the kind that belonged to someone who spent more time in an office than a field. Two people got out, a man in his 40s in clothes that were the wrong kind of casual for a farm visit, and a younger woman with a clipboard. The man introduced himself as Dennis Fairchild, a buyer's agent representing an agricultural land investment group out of Columbus. He had heard the property had a new productive well. He wanted to know if Clara had considered selling. She stood in the equipment barn doorway and looked at him. No, she said. The market right now for properties with confirmed groundwater? No, she said again. He had the clipboard woman with him for a reason. Clara could see it was meant to suggest paperwork, legitimacy, an offer waiting to be written down. She recognized it as the specific theater of a real estate approach that depended on the other party being either desperate or impressionable. She was neither, at least not right now. Ms. Wren, if you just look at the numbers, I have my own numbers, Clara said, and they say this isn't for sale. You're welcome to leave your card on the gatepost if you want, but I won't be calling. He left the card. She left it on the gatepost for 3 days before Evan took it down, and she was never sure whether she had left it there as a reminder of something or simply forgotten to throw it away. What she did know was that the visit had clarified something. The farm was not a gamble anymore. The gamble had been taken. The well was drilled, the water was tested, the flock was healthy, and the land was responding, and her grandfather's map had been right about the one thing that mattered most. The buyers were showing up now. The people who had written the property off were reconsidering. Grayson Cole was walking across fence lines on foot to ask her about drainage patterns. Ruth Halsey from the extension office wanted to document what she'd found. None of that changed what the work was or what remained to do. The Eastern Acres still needed attention. The irrigation infrastructure was a first draft. The equipment barn needed the repairs she kept deferring. There were 100 things on her list that 12 gallons per minute of pressurized groundwater had made possible but had not made easy. She went back to work. That evening, after Evan had gone home and the flock was settled in the western pasture for the night, Clara sat at the kitchen table with her grandfather's ledger photographs spread in front of her. Not reading them, she had read them enough times now to know them almost from memory, just looking at the handwriting. The specific quality of attention that had produced those 11 volumes, the 42 years of observation and documentation, the notation about the western pasture that had waited patiently in a county archive for someone to come back and finish the sentence. She thought about what it meant to inherit a thing, not just the legal definition, the deed, the title, the 72 acres recorded in the county courthouse with her name attached. The other inheritance, the less formal one, the patterns of observation, the habit of looking carefully, the belief that a piece of land would tell you something if you paid attention to it long enough and wrote down what you heard. She had her own 11 notebooks now, filled from front to back with observations, measurements, flock behavior, soil readings, weather notes, drainage observations, the exact date and time the pressure gauge needle had moved on a Wednesday afternoon in October. Her handwriting was nothing like her grandfather's, looser, faster, less architecturally precise. But the impulse behind it was the same. She looked at the map with the western pasture notation one more time. Consistent moisture retention. Sheep return here without being driven. Investigate further for subsurface water potential. Below it, in the same hand, no action taken this season. Next year. She got a pen. On the photograph, not the original, she would never mark the original. She wrote in the margin, next to that notation, action taken, October, 78 feet, 12 gallons per minute. She looked at it. Then she closed her notebook, stacked the photographs back into their folder, and went to bed. Outside, the well casing stood in the western pasture in the dark, the water beneath it still moving through the fracture zone the way it had moved for longer than the farm had existed. Patient, pressurized, waiting to be of use. Wednesday came gray and cold, with a wind off the ridge that had teeth in it. Clara was at the eastern fence line when Cole's truck pulled up the access road at 8 in the morning, exactly when he said he would be there. She had noticed that about him. He arrived when he said he would, and left when he said he would, and did not waste time on the interval between. It was one of the things she had initially read as arrogance, and was revising towards something more neutral. Some people were just organized. He got out of the truck with a thermos and a folded paper that turned out to be a hand-drawn map, his own, done from memory, showing the original drainage configuration of the Wickham Ridge Eastern Acres, before her grandfather had put in the access trail in what Cole estimated was the late 1970s. The drawing was rough but specific, with directional arrows indicating flow channels and a dotted line showing where the natural grade had run before the trail bed interrupted it. Clara looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "You drew this from memory," she said finally. "From memory and from what I watched when I was farming the adjacent section," Cole said. "I wrote some of it down back then. Most of it I just remembered." He pointed at a curve in the dotted line. "The main channel used to run here, along the base of that slight grade you can still see if you look east from the barn. Your grandfather cut across it to get equipment to the back acres without going around. Practical decision at the time. Just changed the drainage." Clara looked from the map to the land, trying to lay one over the other. The slight grade Cole was pointing at was visible once you knew to look for it. A long, subtle lean in the ground running roughly northeast. So gradual she had walked across it 100 times without registering it as a feature. "If the trail bed were regraded," she said, "or rerouted, you'd restore maybe 60% of the original flow pattern. The rest has been altered enough by years of runoff change that you'd need to do some work to redirect it." He paused. "Not impossible. Time-consuming. How long did it take you to draw this?" He looked at the map. 20 minutes. 20 minutes, she said. "I've been looking at this property line for 25 years, he said, without apology, but without pretense either. "Some of it just lives in my head." That was the thing she kept running into with Grayson Cole. The same man who had declared her land dead without looking closely enough was also the man who had been watching its edges for a quarter century and retained more institutional detail about it than anyone living. Those two things occupied the same person without obvious tension, which was the most human thing about him. They walked the Eastern Acres for 2 hours. He talked, and she listened and wrote and asked questions, and he answered the questions with the directness of someone who had stopped managing the conversation toward any particular conclusion. He had brought his own notebook, a battered green one that looked older than hers, and he made small marks in it occasionally, checking his memory against what the ground showed. At one point, he crouched down near a low spot in the eastern section and pressed his palm flat against the soil the way Hoskins had pressed his instrument. "Here," he said, "this is where the flow would pool if you redirected the drainage. This section would respond fastest." He stood up and brushed his hand against his jacket. "The soil here is better than it looks. It's just dry." "Everything here is just dry," Clara said. "Was," he said. She looked at him. He had said it without apparent weight, just the correction of a man adjusting his tense, but it sat in the air between them for a moment with more significance than its 4 letters. "Was," she agreed. Ruth Halsey from the Extension office came out the following week with a recorder and a notepad and a straightforward manner that Clara appreciated immediately. She was 50 or so, with the weathered look of someone who spent more time in fields than offices, and seemed to prefer it. She sat at Clara's kitchen table, accepted coffee, and explained what the documentation project would involve without inflating it. "I want your observation logs from the beginning," she said. "The flock behavior records, the soil data, the correlation mapping. And I want to talk through the methodology, how you were thinking about what you were seeing, not just what you saw." "The methodology was mostly just writing things down," Clara said. "That's the methodology," Halsey said. You'd be surprised how many people don't do it. They see something, they form an impression, they act on the impression without documenting the steps between. Your approach was different. Clara thought about her grandfather's 11 ledgers in the county archive. I learned it from someone else, she said. Your grandfather. You know about him? I looked up the property history when I heard about the well, Halsey said. Arthur Wren's records are in the county archive. I read the relevant sections. She paused. He was doing the same thing you were doing 40 years ago. Same observation approach, same documentation discipline. He just didn't complete the sequence. He noted it, Claire said. He wrote it down. He just didn't drill. He gave you the map. He gave me the map. Halsey wrote something on her notepad. That's going in the write-up, she said. The intergenerational aspect of it. The documentation chain. That's actually the most interesting part of this from an agricultural research perspective. Not just that the water was there, but that systematic observation across 40 years of family history led to its discovery. That's not a story you see often. Clara thought about the photograph of her grandfather's map with the note she'd written in the margin. Action taken. October. 78 feet, 12 gallons per minute. She had written it for herself, or maybe for him, or maybe for no one. Just the habit of documentation, the need to close the record. Can I show you something? She said. She brought out the folder of ledger photographs. Halsey looked through them slowly, turning pages with the careful attention of someone who understood what she was looking at. When she reached the 1987 map with the original notation, she stopped. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Clara. Do you know how rare this is? She said. I know it was lucky, Clara said. It wasn't luck, Halsey said with a firmness that surprised Clara slightly. Luck is finding something by accident. You found this by following a trail someone else laid and having the discipline to document your own observations the same way. That's method. That's repeatable. She set the photograph down. Luck doesn't teach other people anything. Method does. Clara sat with that for a moment. It was not how she had been thinking about it. She had been thinking about it as a series of bets. The sheep, the soil analysis, the drilling decision, each one made on incomplete information. Each one carrying real risk of failure. It had felt like improvisation managed carefully rather than method executed confidently. But maybe those were the same thing, from different angles. I'll get you copies of everything, Clara said. The logs, the soil reports, Hoskins' drilling record, all of it. Including the flock behavior documentation, Halsey said. That's the part people won't expect. That's the part that will make people pay attention. Evan heard about the Extension Office project the evening after Halsey's visit. Clara told him over the dinner that had by now become an established rather than incidental part of the week's structure, Tuesday and Thursday mostly, unless the work ran long on one side or the other. He listened to the whole thing, including the part about Halsey's assessment of the methodology, and was quiet for a moment after she finished. She's right, he said. You don't have to agree with everything she said just because I told you what she said. I know. He moved his fork around his plate. But she is right. The way you worked this, it wasn't the same as just trying things. You had a framework. I had a notebook. That's the same thing. Clara looked at him across the table. He had a habit of reducing complicated things to their essential statement without making the reduction feel dismissive, the kind of thinking that took more work than it showed. It was one of the things about him that she had been cataloging without exactly knowing why she was cataloging it. The eastern section, she said, changing the direction of the conversation because she needed to. Cole's drainage map. I want to start planning the regrading work. Spring, probably, when the ground is workable, but before the growing season. Evan accepted the redirect without commentary. That's a full week of equipment work, minimum. You're thinking backhoe rental? I'm thinking I ask Cole if I can borrow his for a few days, given that he spent 2 hours mapping the problem for me. Evan's expression shifted in the way it did when he was recalibrating something. You're going to ask Grayson Cole to lend you his equipment. I'm going to ask him. He can say no. He won't say no. Probably not. But he gets to say it either way. Evan was quiet for a moment. Things have changed, he said, and it was not entirely about the equipment. Things are changing, she said, which was more accurate. Change in the middle of itself looks different than change from the other side of it. She was still in the middle. Buford Shea stopped her in the parking lot at Decker's on a Thursday morning in late November, which was the last thing she expected. He was the oldest of the men she'd seen that first morning at the feed store counter, close to 70, cattle farmer, the kind of quietly authoritative presence that comes from simply having been somewhere longer than anyone else. He had not spoken directly to her since she returned. He watched things from a distance and formed opinions privately, which was a style she respected even when it made her nervous. "Clara Wren," he said. He said it the way he'd probably said her name since she was 7 years old, with the specific cadence of someone who had known her when she was a different person. "Mr. Shea." "Buford," he said. "I've been farming next to your grandfather's land since before your father was born. You don't need to Mr. me." She almost smiled at the echo of the first conversation she'd had with Cole in this same parking lot. "Buford," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with the patient attention of a man who had decided to say something and was choosing the right form for it. "I owe you something," he said finally. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." He said it plainly. "I was at that counter when Grayson told people your land was dead. I didn't disagree. I've been farming this county long enough to have looked harder than I did." He paused. "Your grandfather was a careful man. I knew that. I should have thought about what it meant that he'd farmed that ground for 40 years. Instead, I looked at the surface and agreed with Grayson." Clara studied him. There was something different about this admission than Cole's had been. Cole had been wrong in a vocal, persistent way and had known it when he corrected it. Buford Shea had been wrong in the quieter way, the agreement by silence, the failure to apply what he knew. That was its own kind of thing. "I appreciate that," she said. "I'm not sure you should," he said. "I'm not telling you this because it helps you. You don't need my acknowledgement at this point. I'm telling you because it's true, and I'm old enough to have stopped leaving true things unsaid." He looked toward the feed store. Grayson was the loudest voice, but there were a dozen of us who heard him and nodded. That includes me. Clara thought about that drive into Pine Hollow Crossing 8 months ago. The fence posts going by, the $43 in her account, the phrase "dead ground walking" that had arrived before she did. "The land wasn't dead," she said. "It was just waiting for someone to look at it differently." "I know that now," Shea said. "Most of us do." He paused. "The sheep. That was the part none of us expected." "The sheep were doing what sheep do," Clara said. "I just paid attention to it." Shea looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something that had been set a long time ago. "Your grandfather would have said the same thing," he said. "In those exact words, I imagine." He went into Decker's. Clara stood in the parking lot for a minute before she followed him in, thinking about what it meant when a community's understanding of a place changed. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of individual conversations, each one a small correction to the record, each one adding up to something different from what it had been. The case study write-up from Ruth Halsey circulated in January, 3 months after the well came in. It went into the county extension archive as planned, and from there, as Halsey had suggested it might, it was picked up by the State Agricultural Extension Network, which distributed it to a mailing list of several hundred county agents and agricultural specialists across Ohio. Clara did not know about the wider distribution until she started getting phone calls. The first was from a county agent 2 regions over who had a similar situation: degraded farmland, a failed well, a property owner asking about viable options. He wanted to talk through her methodology. She spent 45 minutes on the phone with him, going through the observation framework, the sheep behavior documentation, the correlation mapping, the sequence that had led to the drilling decision. The second call was from a graduate student at Ohio State's Agricultural School who was working on a thesis about non-instrumental biological indicators in groundwater prospecting, livestock behavior as a diagnostic tool. She had found Halsey's write-up through the Extension Network and wanted to know if Clara would be willing to discuss her observations. The third call was from Dennis Fairchild, the buyer's agent from Columbus, who had heard about the case study and wanted to revisit the selling conversation. Clara returned the first 2 calls. She did not return the third. She told Evan about the calls on a Thursday evening, a little bemused by the sequence of them. "The grad student wants to come out and observe the flock," she said. "Spend a week, do her own documentation." "What did you say?" I said yes, but she has to stay out of the sheep's way during active grazing hours, and she has to share her data with me. Evan leaned back in his chair. "You're becoming a case study." "Apparently." "How do you feel about that?" Clara thought about it. There was something strange about it. The idea of the work she'd done in private, in notebooks at this kitchen table, in the cold western pasture at 6 in the morning, becoming something that other people would read and cite and derive conclusions from. It felt exposed in a way she hadn't entirely anticipated. But it also felt like something else. Like the documentation, hers and her grandfather's, was finally doing what documentation is supposed to do, passing information forward, making something that had happened in one place useful to someone in another place at another time. I feel like the notebooks were worth keeping, she said. Evan nodded slowly. Arthur Wren's were worth keeping too, he said. You just had to find them. Clara looked at her current notebook open on the table to this week's observations. The flock was doing well through the winter. The access to clean water had changed their condition in ways that were measurable and visible. Their coats denser, their weight up. Their general disposition improved in the way that animals improve when a chronic problem is solved. The western pasture was already showing grass regrowth patterns she hadn't seen in the 6 months before the well. The eastern section was waiting for spring in the regrading work, but even now after the fall rains it was retaining moisture better than it had. A sign, Torres had said, of the soil beginning to recover its own structure. The farm was not fixed. She was clear on that. There was a long list of things that needed to happen before Wickham Ridge could be called a functioning operation in the fullest sense. Money remained tight. The equipment barn still needed work. The irrigation infrastructure was a first draft. 2 of the Suffolk crosses had developed health issues that required ongoing management, and Hattie had knocked over a water trough last week in a manner that was both inexplicable and entirely in character. But the direction had changed. That was the only word for it. Before the well, everything on the farm had been moving toward exhaustion. The land, the finances, the margin between what was possible and what was needed. After the well, the direction reversed. Slowly, unevenly, with complications she hadn't predicted, and setbacks she absorbed one at a time, but reversed. She thought about the night she'd sat at this table with the numbers spread out in her own handwriting, and the margin between drilling and not drilling had been something she could almost have touched. She thought about the feed bucket in the western pasture. She thought about her grandfather writing next year and the year not coming, not in his lifetime. The observation waiting in the county archive for someone who would come back and complete it. She turned to a new page in her notebook and wrote the date at the top. Then she wrote, Eastern section, soil moisture improving pre-spring. Cole's drainage regrading scheduled for April. Grad student arrival confirmed March 12th. Flock condition, strong. Hattie, destructive but otherwise excellent. She looked at what she'd written. It read like a record, like something that would be legible to someone else at another time if they needed to know what had happened here. She closed the notebook. Outside, the wind was moving across the western pasture the way it always did in January, low and steady, bending the dry grass in long, slow waves toward the ridge. The well casing was out there in the dark, invisible from the window but present in the way that things are present when you know exactly where they are. The water was still moving. 12 gallons per minute, pressurized, clean. Patient the way geological things are patient, operating on a timescale that had nothing to do with human doubt or human certainty, indifferent to what people had said about the land above it. It had been there the whole time. April came in wet that year, which was not ideal for regrading work, but which Clara had stopped trying to negotiate with. Cole's backhoe arrived on a Tuesday morning behind a flatbed driven by one of his hired hands. A quiet man named Terrence, who said almost nothing, unloaded the equipment with efficient precision and drove the flatbed back without fanfare. Cole himself arrived an hour later in his truck, not because the work required him, but because, Clara suspected, he had decided he wanted to be there. He stood at the edge of the eastern section with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched Evan run the backhoe along the first cut of the regrading line, following the drainage map Cole had drawn from memory in January. It was slow work. The ground was soft from the wet spring, which helped with the cutting but made tracking the equipment difficult. The backhoe left deep impressions that filled with water almost immediately, giving the whole operation a muddy, unglamorous quality that bore no resemblance to anything you'd see in an agricultural brochure. By noon, everyone involved was wearing half the eastern section on their boots, and the regrading had covered about 40% of the planned route. Clara brought sandwiches out at noon, and they ate standing up near the equipment barn, because sitting down on anything would have required changing clothes afterward. It's going to look worse before it looks better, Cole said, looking at the churned ground. Most things do, Clara said. He ate his sandwich and looked at the work. She could see him running calculations, the same automatic assessment she did herself, the habit of looking at something and measuring it against what it needed to be. It was a habit she had thought of as hers, and was realizing was older than her, passed down through people who had worked this kind of land for long enough that the measuring became involuntary. The grade is right, he said. Once this settles and you get some growth on it, the flow pattern will reestablish. Might take a full season to see the real difference. I can wait a season, Clara said. He looked at her sideways. You've gotten patient. I was always patient, she said. I was just scared before. Those aren't the same thing. He didn't answer immediately. He finished his sandwich, folded the wax paper into a square, and put it in his jacket pocket. No, he said, they're not. The regrading was finished by Thursday evening. The eastern section looked temporarily like something had gone wrong with it. Raw cuts in the soil, tire tracks, the geometry of the new drainage channel visible as a pale line running northeast toward the low point where it would eventually redirect the seasonal flow. It would be ugly for weeks. Then it would start to be something else. The graduate student's name was Meg Calloway, and she arrived in March as planned with a truck full of monitoring equipment, a research protocol that ran to 12 pages, and an adaptability to mud that Clara found immediately reassuring. She was 26, earnest without being naive, and she had the specific energy of someone working on a question they had actually chosen rather than been assigned. She spent her first 2 days doing what Clara had done in her first 2 days, walking the pasture, watching the flock, taking notes. She asked good questions. She was interested in the flock's movement data, but also in Clara's observation methodology, the way the notebooks were organized, the correlation mapping system. On the third evening, sitting at Clara's kitchen table with both their notebooks open, she said, "The thing I can't figure out is how you decided to trust it." Trust what? The pattern, the sheep behavior. At some point you went from observing it to betting on it. That's a different thing. What made you do that? Clara thought about it. Not the polished version. She had given Ruth Halsey the polished version for the case study write-up. The actual version. My grandfather saw the same thing and wrote it down, she said. And the soil data pointed the same direction. And Hoskins walked the surface and saw the fracture. It wasn't just the sheep. The sheep were part of a larger pattern. She paused. But honestly, the other part was that I didn't have a lot of options. I had enough money for one real bet. This was the one that had the most evidence behind it. Meg looked at her. That's not how it reads in the extension write-up. No, Clara said. In the extension write-up, it reads more orderly than it was. Real decisions are messier. I was scared. I almost didn't drill. The methodology was real, but so was the fear. Can I put that in my thesis? The fear part? The decision part. The way certainty and uncertainty were both present. That's actually important for the research, the human threshold question. When does an observer have enough information to act on what they're seeing? Clara considered that. It was a real question. She had been living inside the answer to it for almost a year without fully articulating it. I don't think you ever have enough, she said. I think at some point you have the most you're going to get, and then you decide. There's always a gap between the evidence and the certainty. You just have to decide if the gap is small enough. Meg wrote that down. Clara watched her write it and felt something odd. The slight displacement of seeing your own thinking reflected back at you from outside, rendered in someone else's handwriting for someone else's purpose. Her grandmother had never written anything down, as far as Clara knew. Her grandfather had written everything. She was somewhere between the two, writing things down not from temperament, but from the lesson of what happened when you didn't. The flock numbered 111 by May. 17 lambs had been born in the spring, which was more than Clara had projected, and which had required 3 weeks of intensive management that reminded her, physically, of the first weeks after she brought the original 94 home from Pritchard's barn. She had lost 2 lambs. She had not lost any adults, which was better than the statistical average for a flock of this size in its first full productive year. Hattie had twins. Both survived. This seemed to Clara like information that carried more significance than she could fully account for. The partially deaf ewe, who had arrived as a rejected animal from a lot nobody wanted, Now a mother twice over, both offspring healthy and growing in the western pasture where the grass had come back stronger than anything Clara had seen on the property. The western pasture in May was genuinely different from the western pasture Clara had walked into the previous September. The difference was visible from the ridgeline, a deeper green in that section, a density of growth that contrasted with the rest of the pasture the way a well-watered garden contrasts with the ground around it. Not dramatic, not transformed overnight into something unrecognizable, just the slow accumulation of what regular water does to soil that hasn't had it. Recovery, not miracle. The eastern section was beginning its own, slower version of the same thing. The new drainage channel had settled over the winter and spring, the raw cuts softened by new growth. Water moved through it now when it rained, redirected toward the low point the way Cole's map had suggested it once would have moved before her grandfather's access trail interrupted the pattern. Torres had come out in April to look at it and said what she'd predicted in January. One full season before the real difference showed. But the direction was right. Clara walked the full property one morning in late May, the first time she had walked all 72 acres in a single circuit since the previous fall. She went at her own pace, no particular urgency, just looking. She went along the north fence line where she and Evan had replaced the bad section last autumn. She went through the eastern acres where the regrading cut was already growing over at the edges. She went up the slope toward the ridge and stood at the crown where you could see the whole property laid out below, the farmhouse, the equipment barn, the western pasture and its deeper green, the well casing visible as a small steel cylinder that would look, to anyone who didn't know the story, like an unremarkable piece of farm infrastructure. She stood there for a while. The thing she had not expected, the thing nobody had told her about, because it was not the kind of thing that appeared in agricultural case studies or extension office write-ups or conversations at feed store counters, was how much the place had started to feel like hers. Not in the legal sense. That had been true since the deed transferred. In the other sense. The sense that comes from knowing the ground by foot, from having walked it enough times in enough conditions that your body knows its irregularities. Where the drainage pools after rain, where the fence posts need watching, where the grade shifts under the western pasture, and the sheep will always drift toward water they understood before she did. She thought about that a lot, standing on the ridge. About understanding. She had come back to this farm with a notebook and $43, and the assumption that if she paid close enough attention, she could figure out what the land needed. That assumption had been right, but it had also been incomplete. The land had been telling a story for decades before she arrived. Her grandfather had been one of its listeners. The sheep had been another. The fracture in the ridge rock had been keeping water the whole time, indifferent to whether anyone found it or not. She had not figured out the farm. She had joined a conversation that was already in progress and learned to speak its language well enough to ask the right question at the right time. That distinction mattered to her. Evan came for dinner on a Tuesday evening in June, the way he usually did, and they ate on the porch because the weather had finally turned genuinely warm rather than just theoretically spring. The flock was visible in the western pasture, the lambs now moving with the half-controlled energy of young animals that have become confident in their environment, bolder than they should be, testing distances, occasionally startling themselves with their own speed. Hattie's twins were the easiest to pick out. They had her bearing, that particular forward tilt quality of an animal that has decided to investigate things, rather than wait for things to be safe. 111, Evan said, looking at the pasture. 111. Clara confirmed. I need to expand the western section's fencing by fall if the flock grows the way I'm projecting. That's 3 weeks of work. Closer to 2 if you help. I'll help, he said, without hesitation, which was how he said most things. She had stopped being surprised by that and started simply counting on it, which was a different thing, more honest, less guarded. She was aware, sitting on the porch in the June evening, of what the last 9 months had built between them. Not through any single decision, but through the accumulated weight of Tuesday and Thursday dinners, fence lines replaced, sheep redirected, mornings in the pasture with notebooks. It had the quality of something that had grown in the same quiet way the western pasture had grown, not from a dramatic event, but from regular water, regularly applied. I've been thinking about the wool operation, she said. He waited. The current buyer gives me a bad price because the volume isn't there yet. But if the flock holds at this size through next year and the lamb survival rate stays where it is, I'll have enough volume to approach the regional processor directly, cut out the middleman. What does that change on the margin? Roughly 30% improvement per pound. He did the math visibly. That changes the whole year. It changes the whole year, she agreed. It doesn't fix everything. The equipment barn still needs the roof work, and the irrigation expansion is going to cost what it costs, but it changes the direction of the numbers. The direction has already changed, he said. The direction changed when Hoskins' gauge moved, she said. But change in direction and change in position are different things. We're still catching up. He looked at her. We, he said, not a question exactly. She looked back at him and didn't look away. I've been saying we for about 4 months, she said. I figured you noticed. I noticed. Then yes, she said, we. The evening light was doing what it does in June in Ohio. The slow, reluctant kind of settling that takes hours and produces a quality of gold in the air that makes familiar things look briefly extraordinary. The western pasture held the light differently than the rest of the farm, the fuller grass catching it at an angle that deepened the green. She had noticed that pattern in April and would notice it every June going forward. She suspected the specific way the recovered land received light that had been absent from it for years. Mashbatam. The County Extension Archive received Clara's complete documentation in July. 18 notebooks, the full photograph set of Arthur Wren's 11 ledgers, the drilling record, the water quality reports, the flock behavior correlation maps, and a written account that Halsey had helped her structure into something readable beyond the raw data. Meg Calloway's thesis, completed in June, cited the Wickham Ridge project as its primary case study and had already been accepted for presentation at a state agricultural research conference in the fall. Halsey called Clara the morning the archive accepted the donation. It's officially part of the record, she said. Your grandfather's observations and yours in the same archive, cross-referenced. Clara was standing in the equipment barn when the call came in. She looked at the new roof section, finally done, finished 2 weeks ago by a local contractor she had paid with money from the spring wool sale. It had taken almost a year to get to that repair. She had walked under the compromised roof section probably 300 times in the intervening months, always aware of it, always moving the priority around other things. Good, she said. I want to ask you something, Halsey said. For the record, what do you want people to take away from this? Not the technical piece, the human piece. Clara thought about the question for a long time, long enough that Halsey waited without prompting. I want people to understand that the land wasn't broken, she said finally. It was misread, and the difference between those two things is enormous. Broken means there's nothing left to work with. Misread means someone wasn't looking carefully enough, or asking the right question, or staying long enough to see the pattern. She paused. A lot of things get called broken when they're actually just misread. That's not only true of land. Halsey was quiet on her end for a moment. I'm putting that in the write-up, she said. That's fine, Clara said. She hung up and stood in the equipment barn and looked out through the open door at the western pasture. The flock was out there, 111 animals, doing what they had always done, what their predecessors had done in this same pasture 40 years ago. What animals do when you give them ground and water and time. Moving, grazing, drifting toward what they needed. Hattie was near the well trough, as she usually was in the mornings. Her twins were nearby, investigating the fence post with the undiscriminating curiosity of young animals who have not yet learned that fence posts are not interesting. She watched them with her good ear forward and her bad ear to the wind, the way she always stood, a posture that was compensation and adaptation and completely her own. Clara had thought sometimes about what this farm would look like to someone seeing it for the first time now, whether it would read as a place in recovery or a place that had always been working. She wasn't sure. The difference was visible if you knew the history and invisible if you didn't, which was true of most things. What she knew was what the notebooks knew. The full sequence, from the brown September pasture to the May green, from $43 in checking to a spring wool sale that covered a roof repair, from dead ground walking to 12 gallons per minute of clean water moving through fractured stone that had been holding it in trust for longer than any living person could account for. She closed the equipment barn door and walked out into the July morning. The air smelled the way it had on the first day, dry soil and cedar and something metallic from the ridge rock. That hadn't changed. Some things didn't change with the land's recovery. They were the land's permanent character, older than the drought, older than her grandfather's first season, older than the name anyone had put on the property. She breathed it in and walked toward the well trough where the water was still running, still clear, still exactly what it had always been. The difference was that someone was here to use it now. She picked up the hose she'd left near the trough the evening before, checked the connection to the irrigation line, and opened the valve. Water moved through the line with the quiet, unremarkable persistence of something that has been waiting to do its job and is finally doing it. She stood there and watched it run. Somewhere behind her, Hattie's twins were still investigating the fence post. The rest of the flock was moving through the morning in the loose, unhurried way of animals that have somewhere to be, and enough time to get there. The ridge above the western pasture caught the early sun the same way it always had, the fracture line in the rock face visible as a dark seam if you knew where to look. Clara knew where to look. She turned back to the work.